All right, we'll start it now. You are live, Ed.
All right, everyone, we're going to wait just until the top of the hour before we get started. Really excited, and we're hoping that people will be watching the New York Times homepage to see if we get an election result finalized during the course of this webinar, and then we'll claim credit for it. We're at the top of the hour now, so hello and welcome everyone to our 8th episode of our Climate, Energy versus Climate webinar series. I should start getting that name right by about now. My name is Ed Whittingham, and as always, I'm joined by my co-hosts, David Keith and Sara Hastings-Simon from an unseasonably warm Alberta today. So this may be only our 8th webinar in our Energy versus Climate series, but it's probably the 5,000th worldwide that is debriefing the still unresolved US election. But as far as we know, ours is the first to look specifically of the implications of the presidential election for Canadian energy and policy, energy and climate policy after the election. So if that's what you're interested in, you've come to the right place. And you've especially come to the right place because we have a very special guest with us today, joining us, Dr. Leah Stokes. So Leah is a Canadian who lives down in the US. She is an assistant professor of political science at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She focuses there on energy, climate, and environmental politics, including looking at voting behavior. So having her on the show today is very timely. She is the author of a book called Short Circuiting Policy, which looks at the role that utilities have in promoting climate denial and rolling back clean energy laws. And Leah, if we had more time on another show, I could talk about the incumbents here in Alberta and what they're doing to block investments in clean power in this province. No, unbelievable. I know, who could ever suspect it. Prior to teaching at UC Santa Barbara, Leah did her PhD and master's at MIT, and along the way has advised Canadian parliamentarians as well. So we will get to Leah in just a little bit. The usual webinar housekeeping reminders. So please send in your questions via the Q&A box throughout the webinar. Again, as always, don't use the raise hand function or the chat box, and feel free to upvote people's questions if you like them. And as always, our colleague Mika McFarlane, he's going to screen for live questioners. If you would like to ask your question live on energy versus climate, feel free to do so, but just know you are being recorded for posterity. Now, Mika, let's launch the first poll, please. Poll question number 1 of 2 poll questions today. Assuming Joe Biden wins the US presidency, which looks increasingly like a safe bet, it will be a net positive for Canadian energy and climate policy. Do you agree, disagree, or you cannot say? Let us know what you think. Okay, while those results are coming in, let's have a conversation. So in the US, climate energy policy was solidly a second-tier issue in the election. The election, dominated on a bunch of issues, around a bunch of issues to do with values, to do with the pandemic, halting the recession. But Democrats definitely view climate as a top issue. And the Democratic Party has notably tilted or shifted to the left on climate energy issues. And as evidenced by the Green New Deal and the support it has, particularly amongst the young base in the party. So let's kick it off, given that it's likely we've got Joe Biden as president. Is their starting point, are they too far ahead of the average American voter? And if they are, how is this going to affect their ability, if they do win, to implement their plan? So this is when I open it up to David, Sara, Leah. Who wants to weigh in first?
I think Leah should go first.
Yep.
All right.
Sure, happy to start it off. I don't tend to think about it in those terms, in terms of a ideological issue. When we talk about ideology, it's very constructed. And in terms of climate change, why is it more progressive or leftist to say that we want to do climate policy at the scale of the problem. If you want to say, well, doing climate policy alongside other social policies, that makes it progressive, fair enough. But personally, I think that it's not really about being left leaning or something like that. It's about, are you taking on this crisis at its scale? Because as we know, climate change is not a problem. I mean, of course, every ton matters, but climate change is not really a problem you can solve, by just making a good effort. You actually have to take it on at the scale of its crisis. The other thing I'll say is that I don't think that Joe Biden is ahead of the American people. We have poll after poll after poll, lots of work by the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication, which shows that climate change is a top issue. Fox News on election day was showing 70% of people want more investments in clean energy. Exit polls, whether that was from CNN or NBC, showed that, again, like 70% of people were really worried about climate change. So I think that we've really broken through actually with the American people. And it's not like Joe Biden's stance on climate change was a secret. They actually ran ads in both Michigan and Arizona specifically about climate change. So I think that the American people are seeing the hurricanes and the fires and all the costs of inaction. And I think that they want their federal government to do something about it.
Great. Before we go to David and Sarah, I just want talking about polls. We've got our own poll, and our results are now in. So, is Joe Biden, if he wins, going to be a net positive for Canadian climate and energy policy? 55% of you agree, 10% of you disagree, and 35% say you can't say. Well, hopefully by the end of today's webinar, you'll be able to say. All right, David and Sarah, do you want to comment?
I'd weigh in with some data. So I agree for sure with Leah that many more Americans say they care about climate. They want their government to do something. The question is how much? So Ed opened this with climate is not a one or two issue. So I'm looking at a poll that the Pew Center did, which is a very trusted, careful polling organization that asked the open question, what's your top issue or ranking issues? And on that issue, climate was number 11. Economy, healthcare, Supreme Court, coronavirus, violent crime, foreign policy, gun policy, blah, blah, blah. Climate change was above abortion, but it was the 11th. And I wish that was different, but I think there's something kind of real there. That this is, we absolutely expect to see much more than we did under Trump. Of course, there really has been a change for people to take climate more seriously, but I don't think there is a broad understanding of taking it seriously at the level that, as Leah said, it would take to really pass the policy to drive emissions down in a serious way. I think we've passed the threshold of most people agreeing it's an issue, but I think we're not close to a broad consensus that it's worth spending a couple percent of GDP on it.
Yeah, got you. Sarah?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess I'll say two things. So one thought is sort of how you ask that question, what does it mean for people to be for or against the climate policy? And so, in Alberta, obviously, you have, putting forward climate policy is also, at the same time, putting policies or barriers in place to, what is an incumbent industry here. I think for a lot of the U.S., that's not the case. So when you talk about, something like Keystone, which of course is, very, very hot topic these days, right? So Alberta government has promised over $7 billion and are on the hook for at least $1 billion, whether or not that ends up going ahead or not. And I find, I'm interested in Leah's take on this, but my sense is that the pressure on Biden to go ahead with his commitment, for example, to cancel or prevent the pipeline from being built is more than the pressure from anybody that he would feel to continue it, right? And so you have sort of this, when it comes to how much you want to spend in addition, that's one question, but how strong are the supporters that really want to see, that project, for example, not go ahead? And there, I think that the polling suggests that is quite strong. I mean, the other area that I would point to too, and that comes back, David, to your point around the economy, is the renewable energy growth, in the middle of the US and down into Texas, where, I feel like we've really reached a point where the US and Canada has somewhat diverged on that you have, quite conservative areas of the US that have really embraced the economic benefits that renewable energy can bring. And there are pockets of that in Alberta, but it's not kind of bubbled up to the leadership, I think, in the same way that it has down in the US. So I think that that lens on sort of where Biden decides to go based on, who are the loudest people either speaking for or against is important.
Gotcha. Sara, you took us down the right of way that is the Keystone Pipeline early. I was hoping to delay.
Oh, no.
So we don't have a 50-minute conversation on pipeline politics, but we will get back to it. And let's get back to, say, red state support of renewables when we unpack the specifics of Biden's plan. But for all of you, listen, so Leah, I don't know if you're a dual citizen or not, but you're Canadian living in the US. Sara, David, you are dual citizens. I hear what you're saying. If you look and compare and contrast with the last Canadian election, you had 63% of Canadians who voted for parties that had ambitious climate policies. And it was solidly a top tier issue.
Yeah, on the same kind of open polling, it was number 2.
Canadians really, really, really care about this issue. We actually have been doing, so I work with the Yale program on climate change communication and my colleagues at UC Santa Barbara, as well as Utah State. We do these downscaled maps of what do people think in every county and congressional district or every riding in Canada. And when you just put the Canadian data against the American data, they care more, a lot more. It's like much deeper. Even Alberta kind of looks like an average state in America. It's kind of funny. So you can find that polling. It's on the Université of Montréal's website. Eric LaChapelle was another collaborator on that. And so, yeah, I do think Canadians really care. And it's interesting. I obviously have a lot of family and friends in Canada, and they understand the climate issue. They're very committed to it. They're also committed to other things like banning single-use plastics and, trying to live a more environmentally friendly lifestyle. I don't know if it's like David Suzuki or what, but there seems to be something in the water in Canada that really makes people care a lot about the environment.
Yeah, and you're right, Leah. So even in Alberta, but then if you look at the value study, say Environics Institute has done over multiple decades, you'll see that based on core values questions, not limited to climate, a whole bunch of things, Alberta taxed to the left of Maine in the US. So our most conservative place. And by the way, Alberta, when they've done polling up here, 32% of Albertans support Trump in this election, 32% versus 60% Biden. The national average is, 82 to 90% in provinces support for Biden over Trump. So we still, where we sit in Alberta, we tack to the furthest right in Canada, but left of Maine. So who knows why it is that it sticks more in Canada. It's not like we get any more information than I think Americans do. But it is, and for a couple elections now, it's been a core issue. And I tend to agree with David. I think it's not just second tier, it's probably third tier. And the Biden presidency is going to have to fight, if it's got this massive agenda, to implement it if it is too far to the left of its voters, and it's just not such an issue of concern. But let's leave that conversation. That was sort of an opener. Let's get in now. So Leah, just almost for formality's sake, or perhaps now purely as a history lesson, it looks almost certain that Joe Biden's going to win the presidency, but there's still a pathway for Trump in winning. So let's start. What is Donald Trump's climate and energy plan in the great unlikelihood that he retains the presidency?
Well, I don't know. I think we might agree that it would be easier to get full economy-wide net zero emissions in the next decade than for Trump to win the presidency at this point. That's maybe where we're at. So, Donald Trump is a climate denier. He went to California this summer during the terrible fires that we faced all throughout the West Coast, including into Canada. And he said in front of our Governor Newsom, that, the scientists don't really know that climate change is happening. Both him and Mike Pence consistently said that, whether that was on the debate stage or in speeches. They deny that climate change is real. That's been very disturbing to watch because we've made a lot of progress, I think, in terms of making it clear that climate denial is perpetuated by industry groups and that they are doing it to make money. And we've, I think, moved in some ways politicians away from just being straight up climate deniers. And to see Republicans go back in that direction is terrible because, you know, Donald Trump has a very large platform. Even when he's not president, he's going to have a big platform. And for him putting it out there, we know from political science work that co-partisans, meaning people who share the same party as like Donald Trump, so Republican people in the electorate, they listen to what he says and they drink it up, right? And they believe it too. So my concern is that that may polarize some opinion around climate change after we've really made a lot of progress over the last couple of years. So Donald Trump has no plan on climate change except to roll back a lot of environmental regulations. And then what is Joe Biden's plan? Well, Joe Biden ran on the most ambitious platform in American history on climate action. I think a lot of people don't know that, but it's true. He committed to try to clean up the power sector by 2035, which is faster than any state law in the books in this country. He committed to try to spend $2 trillion on climate action over the next 4 years. And he committed that in that investment, 40% of it would be flowing to disadvantaged frontline communities, which is a pledge that the environmental justice community has been very active in trying to push, whether that's in New York State or other places across this country. And, you know, I was not initially a Biden supporter, but I am extremely enthusiastic about Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. And I'm not just saying that, like, I actually deeply believe that they ran on a climate platform, they're going to govern on a climate platform, and that, you know, this is a top issue for Joe Biden because he says that all the time. And so I'm really excited about their leadership potential.
Great. Okay. I want to unpack certain points of the Biden plan, but David and Sara, maybe I'll start with David. So let's get your take. What does a Biden presidency mean for Canada and specifically Canadian energy and climate policy?
I think it'll definitely push Canadian government to do a little bit more, for sure, than under a Trump presidency, obviously. I think a Biden presidency will mean significantly more action than we would have seen under Obama, basically because the business community's moved and there's much more acceptance that some climate action is really needed. My view is not so optimistic as Leah's. I think that the chance of the really kind of strong action that you need if you were serious about driving emissions down that fast, I don't see that happening under Biden. I just don't think he won a mandate that allows that. It's not just that he probably didn't win the Senate, or if he did, won it marginally. I think that, you know, in Western democracies, if you really want to do something hard, and the fact is, the kind of climate action we actually need to live up to these, it's easy to make commitments saying, you know, I'm going to start exercising really often. I'm going to meet this commitment 10 years out. Those are basically not worth anything. What matters is what politicians actually do in their term, the hard stuff. And if you want to be on track to really drive emissions down, you need to really break some eggs. You need to be spending this, not spending directly, mostly by regulation, but you need to be directing through regulation and some spending, something of order more than 1% of GDP. I don't see any realistic prospect they're doing that because they just don't have a mandate to do it. I think that happens after an election in democracy where climate was very near the top of the agenda and the party that wanted climate action wins. Then you have a mandate to really do some hard stuff. I'm not seeing it. As much as I'd love to see it, as much as Biden may sincerely believe it, 48% of American voters were pretty happy with who they had the last 4 years.
Yeah, but so to push back on that, he wins the presidency. Let's say he wins the Senate as well. I know that that's still very much a TBD. We might not know till January with Georgia and what he has had in his platform, a $1.7 trillion commitment with far-reaching.
It's got even bigger, but yeah.
It's $2 trillion.
Yeah.
Oh, great. It's sort of carve off that for all the votes that apparently he's buying in order to get him over.
No vote buying.
Sorry. No, but sorry, David. I mean, he won. He's got this massive pledge in his platform. Let's say he has the Senate. What's stopping him?
I think the issue is what's labeled climate. So I really want to give Sara a chance to jump in, but let me maybe point a little bit. So will there be a big stimulus? Yeah, everybody wants a big stimulus, but what's really climate? So there's a set of things you do if you just had your eye on the tons. And there's a set of things you do if you kind of generally want to do social stuff that you can kind of label as climate, but it doesn't really do that much to cut emissions. So there's a bunch of stuff that is in this that relates to giving underprivileged communities more money, or to public transit, or solar power on people's roofs that haven't been able to afford it. Those are frankly not things that are that rational to do to cut emissions. They may be good for other reasons, but they're not effective ways to spend your money to cut emissions.
Gotcha. Okay, Sara. So Leah, let's say enthusiastic. We'll say David is cautiously pessimistic. Sara, where do you fall?
I think I'm in the cautiously optimistic side of things. So a few thoughts on that. So I mean, one, even if climate isn't or wasn't a first or even second tier issue, it really, you can't claim that it was hidden, right? I mean, in the last debate, Biden talked about we're going to transition away. I'm going to get the quote wrong, so I won't say exactly, but basically he talked about a transition away from oil, and so
from oil and gas, both.
From oil and gas, yeah.
Oil and gas, yeah.
So I think that anybody who wants to come and say you can't do any of this because there was no mandate, this was a secret or something, that it's really not true. And I think that also, I was doing a lot of work in the U.S. in the Waxman Markey days, so I guess I still wear the scars of that failure and the painful experience that was. But I think that the climate community has gotten a lot smarter since then. There's also been, frankly, just a lot more time has passed. And so solutions have become cheaper, but also people have gotten smarter about what kind of policies work to make this happen. So I agree with David in that, I don't think that necessarily what it's going to be, Biden's sort of general stimulus plan and fixing the country, because there's all kinds of issues that need to be dealt with. It may not have climate as, the main focus there. But I think there's a lot of ways that climate are going to be integrated in that. I think you're going to have the right people around the table who know how to make the choices to do that. And I think that you have, the U.S. and especially through things like the Department of Defense has, kind of a checkbook that, Canadians look at sometimes enviously in terms of the power to actually deploy stuff and get things done. And so, that combined with the ability to, work with states like California who, do have a very clear mandate to move ahead on things like automobile standards and have the size to lead the country. Like I see a path for, a group that is prepared and ready to actually make real change.
Yeah, gotcha. All right, well, I want to unpack parts of the Biden platform. But before I do that, I will share with you, because I conducted a bit of a call around and talking to senior Government of Canada officials, some of whom may be watching as we broadcast live to this, and they shall remain nameless. But it was completely non-scientific. You could count it just on the fingers of one hand. But here was their take on a Biden presidency. And this is in the last 24 hours. So one, whereas in 2016, everything got harder, everything they expect will get a little bit easier on climate energy policy. They see it as a positive step, that they see lots of opportunities to realign Canadian policy. And a couple examples, one in vehicle emission standards, where if the feds tie themselves to what California is doing and Biden hits some of the things that he's hoping to hit, that then Canada and the US can move in lockstep again. Whereas before there is contemplation, a continued Trump presidency, that Canada would, in an unprecedented way, break on things like fuel regs. And I would say add to that methane, because I was around when Alberta and the then Alberta government in 2015 came up with the most aggressive or ambitious methane reduction target, which then BC adopted, which then the federal government adopted. And then at an Obama-Trudeau summit, during the 1 year that they overlapped, Obama committed to regulating not just new sources of methane, but existing sources. And at the next Three Amigos summit, then they brought on Mexico. And suddenly you had a continental-wide approach to methane until Trump came in. And then that pact was broken. Yeah. So they see lots of opportunities for that kind of realignment, with a massive caveat from everyone I talked to in my non-scientific call around, that it actually really depends on what happens in the Senate. And therefore it depends on how much of that 1.7 trillion, or Leah, 2 trillion, he can actually spend. And that, of course, with the Senate race, at this point, we probably won't know until the Georgia runoffs are done. So there you have it, live, recent, and what the government of Canada, senior official.
Live anonymous leaks from inside the government of Canada.
Yes. Yeah. We didn't even have to go to, the fifth level of a parquet to have this conversation. Okay, let's get into the deeper dives. Power and renewables. So the Biden campaign commits to full decarbonization of the US power sector by 2035 using a technology neutral national energy efficiency and clean energy standard. Is it feasible? And then let's talk a little bit about sort of blue state versus red state views on renewables. And that's for those of us in Alberta that, the red state view on renewables would be an interesting comparison or contrast to Albertans' views on renewables. So Leah, over to you.
Yeah, well, this is something I work a lot on. It's kind of my specialty. And actually, I have a podcast called A Matter of Degrees, and we did a whole episode on Biden's 2035 pledge. In that episode, we interviewed Sonia Agarwal, who works at Energy Innovation and was part of the 2035 report. If you could just go to 2035report.com. What they did is they modeled the power sector and they said, can we get to 90% clean by 2035? And they found that, yes, we can do it with existing technology. It will actually save ratepayers money. And of course, it will save an enormous amount of emissions and air pollutants. And the great thing about cleaning up the electricity sector is that it allows for electrification of other sectors, right? So when you think about climate change, there's emissions, they're coming from all over the place. It's kind of overwhelming. But if you have electricity that's clean, you can use it to power cars, homes, even some parts of heavy industry. And so you can actually clean up maybe as much as 70% of our emissions through a clean electricity system. Based on that work that I've done, I do think it's very viable to try to push this hard and to do it by 2035. And in terms of the red state, blue state divide, what's interesting is that 1 in 3 Americans today live in a place that's already targeting 100% clean electricity. And in Ohio, remember, a state that voted for Trump, they actually passed a ballot initiative in Columbus that was targeting 100% clean for that city by 2023 during the election. Nevada passed a constitutional amendment targeting 50% clean by 2030. So, there actually is a fair amount of progress happening on renewables, even in red states. We don't have the same laws on the books, I would say, although actually a majority of states, including Republican states, have some clean energy target, even if it's not 100%. So I think that this is actually a really good path forward. And I don't know if we'll see a piece of legislation in Congress, probably not if we don't win the Senate, but I do think that this is a really bold and ambitious agenda that people can rally around.
Yeah. And Leah, just to be clear, so red state support, and I know it's going to differ from state to state, but generally, like you look at here in Alberta, we had a change in government in 2019 and a provincial government that had strong policy and program support for renewables, including government-backed PPA programs, PPA purchase programs. New government came in and said, we love renewables, but we're not going to spend a red cent on them. They have to stand on their own. The amazing thing is that with the cost curve declines, that's renewables and the auctions of the previous government helped to establish that you can build wind and large scale solar fairly cheaply in a very competitive way. Is the red state approach that we'll set these targets, but then we're not going to spend a red cent on them, that renewables just have to stand on their own strength?
I mean, maybe the production tax credit and the investment tax credit, which are the sort of backbones of how a lot of renewables have been built in the United States, they've been championed by Republican governors, by Republican representatives and senators, people like Chuck Grassley. This isn't just something that Democratic states want, because you have places like Kansas, for example, that are very windy states that have Republican parts of that state that benefit a lot from wind development. The same thing could be said for Texas. So I don't know if we'll see extensions of the tax credits, but I think that's a possibility with Republicans. And, as you said, renewables are getting so cheap that they can be built maybe without incentives in some cases. And what's really important about getting rid of Trump specifically is that not only is he not for, supporting clean energy, he's actually for kind of taxing it. So there have been changes put in place under the Trump administration, like the minimum offer price rule, which basically make renewables more expensive. So, you know, at least not moving in that direction will be helpful, right? Like, we don't want to be subsidizing coal and not subsidizing clean energy, which is exactly what the Trump administration has been doing, for example, in the CARES Act. So even if we don't get to a place where we're seeing tax credit extensions or grants for clean energy, if we can just stop subsidizing the heck out of fossil fuels, then that would be helpful too.
Gotcha. Okay. Sara, let's talk about bring it back to Canada. So if the US now has a full decarbonization target by 2035, should Canada have the same target? And as context, Canada right now it's a different, more nuanced target. It's zero emitting sources. 90% of Canada's electricity will be from zero emitting sources by 2030. Should we move to full decarbonization?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's clear that we should move to more, and of course, you know, the math on decarbonized electricity across Canada is highly regional, right? So, you know, we're a good way to that 90% because of some provinces that have a lot of hydro, but of course, here in Alberta, we still have a highly carbonated electricity sector, we could call it. And I think one important lesson from the 2035 report, and you know, some recent work that was also done by the Pembina Institute as well, which looked at the question from a slightly different way. So rather than looking at that end target and doing that modeling, but actually just saying, well, if you were going to build the next incremental bit of electricity in the province, what would be the cheapest option? And by far and away, even in Alberta with our, you know, very, very cheap natural gas, a clean portfolio, so a mix of wind and solar with a bit of battery and a bit of demand response to kind of smooth that out, was the cheaper option. And so I think we really are, I feel like we're really challenged in Alberta, and I would put Saskatchewan under that umbrella too, into still this mindset of, you know, we have 30% by 2030 as our target in Alberta, and people worry, and I can see Leah laughing, which is fair, and people are genuinely worried that like, oh, you know, we couldn't get to 50%. It would be technologically impossible. You know, we wouldn't be able to manage the variability, and that's just simply not true anymore. And so I hope that, you know, seeing that 100% target or 90%, whatever it ends up being by 2035, does get people to think a bit more deeply around Alberta, and then particularly before we go and build out, you know, we do have the coal coming offline, which is great, but before we go and build out, you know, a bunch of new natural gas infrastructure that's going to come at a big cost to ratepayers in the province, that we look more seriously at increasing that target.
Gotcha.
Can I inject some skepticism? U.S. electric power grid is a little over half a terawatt of average power now. If you're going to do it all by renewables, you know, with capacity factors of order 30%, you're doing some mix of wind and solar, you need 1.5 terawatts, 1,500 gigawatts. And you need to figure out how to manage variability. And I think you're not going to do seasonal variability with batteries on that time scale. I just think that probably that's effectively zero. So you'd have to be really serious about doing something else. There are clearly things you could do, and you got to build transmission infrastructure. And that means you got to change the way transmission infrastructure gets built, because right now we can't permit it. So just to put that in perspective, if you want to build 1,500 gigawatts in over 15 years, that's 100 gigawatts a year. You know, right now, last year for solar in the US, we put in 13 gigawatts DC, so you can't count that actually, more like 12 or 11. I think people are, you know, it's easy to do some modeling studies, but what it actually means step by step to really do that, I believe it is actually just in the bounds of possible. I believe you could decarbonize at least to like, you know, better than 90% by 2030. That's doable. 2035, I think is doable. But I think that entails a level of commitment that seems almost inconceivable under Biden, because you actually have to pass not just a little bit of subsidies, you've got to pass hard laws that change the way you site infrastructure. You've got to be able to actually build a bunch of new pumped hydro, for example, if you're going to manage it. You're not going to do batteries at that scale. And I don't see that level of power to do that.
Yeah, but David, so on that, I'd like to get, you've worked in direct air capture, carbon capture and storage. There's something called the Section 45Q, which is a production credit in the US. It's proving to be highly successful insofar as since the last time that the US government topped up the rates, there have been 25 new projects announced on the books at various stages of development. Some of those projects are for the power sector. So it might not all be renewables, but we're still looking at decarbonized power, say through combined cycle natural gas with carbon capture. Could we get there and have a chunk of that zero emission power coming from that avenue and renewables? It doesn't, so we agree it doesn't violate the laws of physics, but when you layer in cost and say stakeholder expectations, could you get there?
Technically, yes. But I think the question is it plausible that a Biden administration over its first 4 years, let's say, would actually be putting in the level of things that I think require not just a little more incentives and not just some regular stuff the Supreme Court doesn't block, but actually like a massive new pieces of legislation that are enabling. I find it a little hard to believe. I think we can do much better than we were doing before, but I think decarbonizing that fast is a level of build out. I mean, remember how big those numbers are, 150 gigawatts a year. Yes, you could do some CCS, but remember, I've got friends that have been working on natural gas CCS plants for 10 or 15 years. There isn't one of them operational now.
Gotcha.
So
Okay.
I do know a lot about this topic. It's what I work on. And, you know, the US is on track this year in a pandemic, which I find shocking, to put in 37 gigawatts of renewables, which is smashing previous records. And let's just remember, economic crisis, recession, coronavirus. I'm shocked by that number, to be honest. And so that's a big number. The calculations that I've seen done, there's actually a new report out of Princeton in the last couple of weeks, the net zero report. They're talking like 100 gigawatts of installed capacity a year. I agree that that is obviously a multiple of anything we've ever done before. And as David says, transmission is going to be key to that vision. Now, there is actually some money already in the federal government, and I understand it, to do transmission that has never been spent, right? Like there is money that sits around in bank accounts, basically, in the federal government that obviously the Trump administration has not been willing to expend. And then there is also, let's say, $500 billion a year of general government appropriations that is like procurement or agency spending. And I agree that it's going to be hard to green all of that, but I don't think that we can say that we can't move faster. Certainly having a cooperative federal government is better than having an uncooperative federal government. Can we get to 100 gigawatts? Can we build out all the transmission of our dreams? Can we do executive action to streamline permitting? You know, I don't know what the limits of that will be, for sure. I think it is, you know, obviously I've spent the last few days very sad about the prospect of not having Democratic control of the Senate. And I think David's reflections on what that means for a 2035 target are real. But I do feel like, you know, that number is not meaningless because it also puts pressure on other states, whether that's California or New York, to maybe speed up their own targets. And I got to say, the one thing that leaves me very hopeful is Google. Google actually announced a pledge that they want to have 100% of all their facilities operating with clean energy 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in real time. And they are one of the largest energy consumers in the country. So, you know, will they get that done? I don't know, but that's a real commitment. That's going to involve building things and also figuring out the intermittency problem and figuring out how you can manage it across a lot of facilities all across the country. So I feel like we are at least pointing in a better direction now. And whether or not we get a specific law on this, we can hopefully make a bunch more progress.
Just 1 second. No question we can go a lot faster. I did not mean to be that down. I'm just trying to emphasize how hard it is to go that fast. And on transmission, yeah, you sit and talk to Ernie Moniz. They were sitting on money to build Clean Line. The issue wasn't money. The issue is permitting. And the issue is permitting through red states where there are going to be people with shotguns. That's the reality.
Yeah, and that's why doesn't violate the laws of physics, but once you layer in funding and social license constraints.
And shotguns.
Yeah, and shotguns. But Leah, thank you for the Google point. Now I feel a little bit better about giving all my data to Google for free so I can sell it out the back door to marketers because it's taking some of that investing in renewables. I feel a lot better. We have a related question. When I call upon questioners, I apologize in advance if I get your name wrong. It's a related question. We've got another question after that, and I do want to make sure that we talk about oil and gas, because that's, of course, very germane to those of us who happen to sit in Alberta. So Robert Tremblay, please, your question, and welcome.
Hey, everybody, you can hear me?
We can, Robert.
Perfect. All right, so yeah, it's kind of on what you guys have been talking about a little bit the last bit, federal versus state leadership. So in the wake of lack of leadership from President Trump, many states and local governments stepped up, such as California or New York City, to pass policies like 100% clean energy standards. Biden's targets net zero by 2035. And it seems to me like the effort has been more productive at the state and local levels than passing big countrywide policy. So how can Biden lead on electricity decarbonization without distracting from effort on passing those same policies at the local or state level? Thanks.
Leah, back to you. Do you want to, it's your area.
Sure, I don't really
Can you
think
take a
there's a
crack?
distraction issue. I think that these things are proceeding in parallel in many ways. You know, for example, states have been doing a lot to a couple of them, like New Mexico and Colorado, to try to use a new financing mechanism to help retire coal plants. That's going pretty well. You know, are there ways that the federal government can help ramp that up? What can we do? We can do more through legislation, obviously, but there are also existing agencies and pots of money, like, for example, the Rural Utility Service, which can be used to help retire debt on the balance sheets of of rural electric co-ops. And so that's something the federal government can be doing. I think it's more about complementary, right? I don't think that the federal government doing something, it's going to somehow take away from what states and cities were doing. What we were really hoping for was a federal clean electricity standard. And with the Senate not going towards Democratic control, that's going to be difficult. However, we still have the Clean Air Act. We still have Massachusetts versus EPA, which says that the federal government has a requirement to regulate greenhouse gases. And obviously, what Obama tried to do with that was the Clean Power Plan, which was a way of trying to do like an executive action version of a clean electricity standard. So I don't know what a Biden version of that will look like, but at the very least, it will involve reversing the ACES rule that Trump put in place, which is moving us again in the wrong direction. So I feel semi-optimistic about the power sector and how the federal government can help move it forward.
Great. Okay. I want to put a pin in the conversation right now around electricity grid decarbonization. We've got another live questioner, Dan Vinelovich, whom some of us know and know well. Dan, over to you, please.
Great. Thanks, Ed. I'm curious to hear from all of you on what elements of Biden's plan, if any, you think might have a chance of securing Republican support in the Senate, and related to that, what might some of the trade-offs be to secure that support?
Great. This is when we get to talk about oil and gas, perhaps. So, let's look at it. What are the issues? So I talked about electricity. There's oil and gas. There are EVs, hydrogen policy, carbon capture. Nothing about carbon pricing. What could possibly get bipartisan support? The way back in the days you mentioned your bill, Sara. I remember being in DC around. It would have been Warner Lieberman when that bill was released, yep. And at the time, that was the latest and greatest, and something that had bipartisan support. Then it went on to die a long, drawn-out, grisly death. So, what could get that support?
So I'll throw one in the mix, bringing it back to a topic we had talked about a couple of weeks ago, actually, but around development of critical minerals and the metals and minerals that are needed to build out all the wind turbines and solar panels we were talking about earlier. There has been a bipartisan interest even before this election around developing the U.S.'s capabilities, whether it's in more in the rare earths, but I think also increasingly thinking about things like lithium and nickel and others. And so I think that there's the potential for, the kind of mining part of and resource extraction piece of a plan to really get bipartisan support, which then becomes, the sort of the source of materials to build out what's needed.
So at the risk, Sara, of redoing our episode from, was it 2 episodes ago? Is this an opportunity for Alberta? If you get that bipartisan support, will we have an easier time shipping our precious metals and precious materials and minerals for clean energy down to the south than we do our oil and gas products?
Definitely. I mean, even now, there's agreements between the U.S. and Canada to work on this. Not a lot has really happened until now, but I think there is, at the federal level, there's interest. I think that the Alberta and Canada more broadly have a big potential to be selling those materials and shipping those materials instead of the oil. If we see a decline there, so I think that's a huge opportunity and something that could very much go ahead with whatever Congress looks like.
All right, David and Leah, your bold, fearless predictions. What could get bipartisan support?
I have one that I think is easy, which is really big increases in clean energy R&D and even in some climate science. So I think, to be clear, my long-term view is that often a big R&D push is an excuse for inaction, and that really we just should deploy. So I'm not one of these people who says it's sort of R&D heavy, but I think the reality is it's relatively cheap, and it's something that's easy to get both sides to agree on. So I could see a really big increase. And, often the sort of enviro left doesn't even want to support particularly more climate science because we assume the science is settled. But I think there actually is cause to really do more. Like, why are we not spending $1 billion a year to really try and figure out what will happen to West Antarctica? Right now, we have like handfuls of people working on this. And I think I could see that really getting a lot of traction. And there will be certain stuff like CCS for sure.
Yeah. Okay. Leah?
Yeah, I don't think necessarily, well, Republicans, I would say Mitch McConnell is the problem more than it is every single Republican.
For sure.
Lisa Murkowski tried to put forward an energy bill in about February of this year, and she couldn't get the bill any attention because he refused to let her. So, it's been sad to see how much fossil fuel money has really made its way into the Republican Party and particularly into the leadership, certainly into Donald Trump's decisions about who he put at various agencies, right? These are literally lobbyists for the industry who then went and ran the DOE or the EPA or whatever. So, I don't feel like there's no hope. It's been sad because we haven't been able to find very many champions, but in part that's because the leadership has not been providing any space for them to do any work on this issue. So certainly my friends at the Niskanen Center, which is a right-leaning think tank that does a lot of climate stuff, they always say that they know there's some people willing to vote on it. I believe it when I see it, but, I'll be somewhat optimistic. And I do think, we always talked about infrastructure under Trump. Trump was incompetent and unwilling to do anything, but maybe we could see infrastructure. And Biden, unlike Trump, is a person who likes compromise, who wants to work across the aisle, who has a really deep history of bipartisanship. And I think that's actually going to turn out to be a huge asset. Now, Mitch McConnell, again, as I said, is a problem because he might not let anything get going. But I think we can find Republicans willing to act on climate change. What they'll be willing to do, I don't know. But the federal government is going to have to pass a couple bills. And maybe Nancy Pelosi through the House can get certain parts into the House side, and then we can get it through Congress overall. So I'm not totally pessimistic, but I don't know, maybe it'll be coming through an infrastructure bill, a general budget bill, a coronavirus relief bill. And as David said, maybe there'll be kind of like climate greening of other things we were going to do otherwise, as opposed to super perfect deep emissions cuts policies. But you know what? We take what we can get. You know what I mean? That's the climate movement for you. We take what we can get.
Fair enough.
Yeah. And so I jokingly said when I introduced the question, we won't get bipartisan support on carbon pricing. And it's hard to get that in Canada, right? Although deeply conservative provincial governments have come to power, and Doug Ford in Ontario, Jason Kenney in Alberta, and they have not rolled back industrial carbon pricing regimes. But why in the US, and we reminisced about the good old days of Waxman Markey and Warner Lieberman, and Kerry was in there for a bit. And there was talk about bipartisan support. Why is that completely off the radar screen so far that Joe Biden has this $2 trillion commitment and carbon pricing really doesn't figure in? What happened? When up here in Canada, we'd say it's one of the most important tools that you need to combat climate change.
Well, I'm happy to comment on that. I mean, Joe Biden has a deep commitment to not raising taxes on the middle class and not raising taxes on anybody who makes $400,000 or less. And the fact is, carbon pricing raises taxes on those people, period. when we think about the transition, we have to think about who's paying, and there are choices. There are distributional choices about whether or not we put it onto the government balance sheets, through taxpayer revenue, through debt, or we put it onto ratepayers. And I think that there is a concern, particularly in this moment. I don't know if people have been following it, but millions of people, record numbers of people across the United States are in arrears on their electricity bills. They are being threatened with shutoffs. In fact, right before the election, moratoriums in a number of states in terms of shutoffs got lifted, including in a lot of swing states, actually. So I think the idea of raising people's energy bills during a deep economic crisis, during a pandemic, I don't know if that's going to be on the table. I personally think it's going to need to be more carrots than it's going to be sticks. So that's what I think about it.
But so I understand that, Leah. You sound very much like a conservative voter, or you sound like Aaron O'Toole, the new leader of the Conservative Party.
No, I don't at all. I sound like somebody who cares
Whoa.
about
No, I'm not saying. Hey, I'm not saying that as a
Aaron
pejorative.
O'Toole.
I'm not saying that as a pejorative.
Yes,
but
I know who that is, being Canadian as I
yes,
am.
I know you do. So to be clear, it's not a pejorative.
Yes.
But so where's Biden then on
Well, I just think you can critique carbon pricing from multiple ways, right? You can critique carbon pricing from I don't want to do anything on climate change perspective. You can also propose carbon pricing from an I don't want to do anything on climate perspective, because you say, oh, we'll do this thing, knowing it's never going to get done or that it's going to be unpopular. I've written a whole long essay on this topic called The Trouble with Carbon Pricing in the Boston Review. But in general, I take income inequality very seriously. And I think that the problem with carbon pricing is that when you have massive income inequality, and keep in mind, the United States does not have the same kind of social safety net that Canada has, right? Like people who are dealing with massive income inequality and don't necessarily have healthcare and don't necessarily have a safety net to catch them, those increases in the bills can mean even more in the United States. So I think it just has a potential to be very politically toxic. So yeah, that's what I think. It doesn't at all mean that I don't think we should do things. My proposal is standards, like clean electricity standards, investments, federal government spending, and justice-oriented approaches, which maybe, as David would say, aren't going to squeeze as many carbon out, but they are going to address some of these simultaneous crises that we have. So yeah, it is not at all to say we shouldn't do things. I just think that approach may lead to backlash.
Got you. Okay, fair enough. Listen, this conversation is flying by. Perhaps some of our Eastern viewers have already cracked beers of the late on this Friday afternoon. I don't want to leave before we've been able to unpack oil and gas, and specifically what it means for oil and gas producing jurisdictions, especially up here in Canada, especially where three of us live here in Alberta. So we'd mentioned that during the second debate, Joe Biden promised to transition the U.S. away from oil and gas by 2050. Remember when our prime minister in 2017 said roughly the same thing and actually had to go back and clarify his comments when he was talking about transitioning away from the oil sands, and I didn't mean that. I didn't see any clarifications of Joe Biden's comments after the debate. I saw him solidly sticking by them. But he has also promised to block the Keystone XL pipeline, go back to Obama-era methane regulations, 500,000 new EV charging stations. What does all this mean for Canadian oil and gas exports? And now, Sara, we can get back to that Keystone right away that you had us heading down earlier in the chat. So, Sara, what does it mean?
Well, it's funny. I'm usually not the pipeline person too. I actually have not worked a lot in pipelines on my career, but I'll sort of repeat briefly what I said at the beginning, which is I think that the hope that some people in the oil and gas industry in Canada have to, find some compromise or, I don't know, in some cases threaten the US with the big scary Canadians coming across the border. I just don't see a lot of potential there, because I see, if I'm Joe Biden and I'm doing that calculation, I've made a promise about this pipeline, which, let's be honest, the pipeline now, it means a lot more than just the oil that's flowing through it, right? It's taken on this sort of symbolism of its own. And so he's made this promise. He has a lot to lose by walking back on that. And I just don't see what Canada can give him or threaten him with that is equivalent. That's how I see it from up here. I don't know how it looks in the US though.
He has a lot to lose. But do you think personally, like, I don't know, is it a policy decision or is it a personal decision from him? Does Joe Biden really believe on principle that Keystone should not be extended into the US? I mean, and look at executive action. You could say he can't back down, but what executive action on that pipeline to date has meant diddly squat. It's had actually Trump tried to sign it into power with executive action, then it got blocked into court. So sorry, I'm pressing you on that one, Sara.
I mean, I guess I sort of think it doesn't matter what Joe Biden personally thinks about it, but sort of how it fits into the commitments that he's going to keep to, the people from the climate coalition that have supported him. And I think that this is one that sort of, if anything, I would say it has more importance than it deserves in some sense from a GHG perspective. But it's all the more reason that I think it's very hard for him to walk back on that. And so I don't see that turning around. I also don't, as we've talked about too, I don't see that, making a huge difference in terms of the industry in Alberta either, because I don't think that, fundamentally it's going to be the demand falling with a lot of EVs coming on that makes the bigger difference. And I think that really, the pace that can happen with the federal procurement and all the agencies that can be, basically immediately buying only EVs, and what California can do if they, get their waiver and can move ahead. I think that is really significant.
Gotcha. So David, executives of major energy companies downtown Calgary, are they excited? Are they walking around fearful, looking like they've just been to a funeral? Does it make a difference who is in power in the White House down south?
I think they're definitely fearful. I think, yeah, I really agree with what Sara just said. I think, of course, Albertans are in some sense, the Alberta oil industry is in some sense correct to say that they were unfavorably made a target because the tar sands really aren't much worse than any other oil and gas, and we treat our workers better than Nigeria, and all that stuff is kind of true. But so what? What would be the upside to Biden in reversing that? The reality is oil and gas is going to go down. And I just want to end there. I think it was actually a really interesting and big deal that Biden was able to say that about transitioning away without walking it back. And we haven't got there in Canada, right?
Yep.
So it's harder in Canada because we depend on oil and gas more. But we haven't got to the point where political leadership in Canada are willing to say, even if it's a long, long way down the road, willing to just be honest about the fact that if we're going to solve the climate problem, we're not cleaning up oil and gas, we are transitioning away from it. Maybe we can argue, maybe it's a whole lifetime away, but we're going to transition away from it. And that we haven't got to the spot in Canada where a political leader is saying that clearly.
Yeah, and where I think we've got to in Canada is you can have major leaders, including like Jason Kenney, saying we are going to transition, but oil and gas will be a part of that transition for decades to come. No one, I think, who is anywhere to the right of, some of the, we'll have some of the hardcore Green Party members will say that we're transitioning away from the oil and gas industry. Leah, you're from Canada. We tend to obsess about this in Canada and what's going to happen with this pipeline decision. And I've had U.S. consul generals joke when they've been up here in Calgary, they get the junior minister for tourism from Nordegg, Alberta, coming and wanting to meet, and they'll talk about tourism to Nordegg, Alberta for 5 minutes. And then they'll say, what I really want to talk to you about is the Keystone Pipeline and why you should support it. And he would say, you know what? We don't care. Like, frankly, it's a national decision. Canada is that much part of the decision. But what's your take? So as a Biden,
I think David and Sara both kind of nailed it. I mean, that pipeline's not getting built, man. It's just not. I mean, that's not breaking news either. It's interesting. In Santa Barbara, we've been fighting oil developments, and they got canceled on election day, which was kind of cool because the developers pulled out because, as Sara said, the prices are not there. Demand is falling as we get more and more EVs on the road. I mean, that's going to maybe be a long-term trend. And similarly, actually, Texas canceled an LNG terminal a couple days after the election. So Where the movement seems to be having a lot of wins right now is in blocking stuff and shutting stuff down. We've had big commitments to shut down coal plants in the last week too. Where we're not winning as much, as David has pointed out, is on like building the new clean stuff fast enough, getting the transmission lines built, scaling up that 37 gigawatts, which is a big deal, but to even more, right? And that's where it'll be hard because we need maybe money for that. We need maybe laws. And so it's going to be challenging. We need local support. But where the Keystone Pipeline is concerned, man, that's been a long fight, and that's never happening. Sorry.
Yeah. And so good observation, Leah, on where we're at in the movement. Those of us who dabble in public policy change know it's easier to run a no campaign,
Yes.
whether it's no pipeline or even no carbon tax, than it is, frankly, to run a yes campaign.
Yes.
Okay, Mika, could you launch the last poll, please? We're just about out of time. One thing you could help us with, Leah, is one question we didn't get to is people are wondering how the new Supreme Court composition, how that might affect Joe Biden's ability to implement his climate energy plan. Not asking you to answer that now, but if you know of any thoughtful pieces on it that you could share with us, we'll make sure we'll share that out with our listenership and readership.
I mean, the only thing I'd say is people should read about the Chevron doctrine because that's a problem, amongst other things.
Chevron doctrine. Okay, well, maybe we can send something out on that.
Teaser trailer. Figure out what that is. You can Google it.
Yes, a teaser for Leah Stokes, her triumphant return to Energy versus Climate 2 months from now. We would love to have you back. So we've launched our last poll. Will the U.S. under Biden reassume its past Obama-era global leadership role on climate energy issues?
I do not know who's voting no to this.
Yeah,
really?
how can that be not? Yeah, that's obvious.
Biden has already said, he already tweeted, it was one of the first things he tweeted, that we're going to be back in Paris.
But Leah and David, the voters are never wrong. And we have to count every vote here.
We do. We have to count every vote. People, the polls are open.
The voters absolutely are wrong. There's been this really fun stuff. I've seen interviews in the U.S. where we used to tend to think that people who were swing voters, we revered them as being these smart, wise people who weren't ideological. There have been some wonderful interviews with swing voters this time, and the answer is that swing voters this time are just people who don't give a shit, or clueless.
Yeah. Yes. Well, on this little poll, which we will leave open till the end of the day, and all votes will be tabulated, 3/4 of you agree that the U.S. will resume its leadership position, and 1/4 of you disagree.
I have a positive spin on that quarter. I didn't vote, but I think what I imagine some people could be seeing is some of the other countries that are stepping up, right? And so, China has made some big pronouncements in the last days and months. I mean, this one's more of a joke, but I guess Russia was Putin ordered his government to find a way to meet Paris to troll Trump or something. I don't know, but them aside, but the EU and many places are moving forward. So, in so much as the US isn't a leader anymore, maybe that's just because everybody else is, running alongside or even ahead. Not because they're not back in the race.
And maybe Canada could move a little faster too, right?
Yes.
Here.
And yes, the voters have spoken. They're never wrong. We've counted every vote. In spite, Leah and David were urging me to stop counting.
No!
They're threatening to sue me, to stop the count. All right. Thank you.
Only stop the count in Sesame Street, the puppet. Have you guys seen those memes where it's like the count? It's the only count I'm trying to stop.
Yeah, I saw one of the late night hosts. They had dueling Trump rallies of both stop the count and keep on counting. And then they juxtaposition them next to each other. Anyways, it's ludicrous. Leah, thank you so much. You're in the belly of the beast in terms of, the excitement right now. Really appreciate you taking the time to join us.
Thanks so much for having me on. Lots of fun to talk.
All right, my closing remarks. Remember, this episode will be available at energyversusclimate.substack.com for reviewing or as a podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, wherever you listen. Give us feedback at energyversusclimate@gmail.com. Thank you, as always, to our producer, Eva Voinagescu, and to Mika McFarlane on today's webinar for all your webinar support. And we'll see you again in 2 weeks 2 weeks' time, we will have former Green Party Canada leader, I got to get used to that, Elizabeth May, who will join us to talk about nuclear power in Canada. You won't want to miss that. Thanks, everyone.
Ooh.
Have a great weekend. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.